August 15, 1987. The Intercontinental Hotel, Medellin. 200 witnesses packed the ballroom when rival cartel leader Rodriguez stood up at Pablo Escobar's own peace summit and played a recording that made the most feared man in Colombia go silent for 60 seconds. Rodriguez had audio of Escobar begging for his life, crying like a child when the military closed in on his hideout the month before. The room went dead quiet. Escobar's lieutenants reached for their weapons. 200 people held their breath, waiting for blood. That's when Pablo Escobar smiled. What happened in the next 5 minutes changed everything. 3 cartels merged overnight because of it. The DEA created a new task force, and for 37 years, survivors of that night have been disappearing one by one. The recording was a setup, and someone in that room knew exactly what was coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Elena Vasquez felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at the black and white photograph that had been slipped under her bookstore door. The Intercontinental Hotel ballroom, frozen in time. 200 faces caught in that electric moment when Rodriguez's recording had finished playing and Pablo Escobar's smile began to spread across his face like spilled oil. Her hands trembled as she picked up the photograph, and there, circled in red ink, was her own face in the crowd. 25 years old, DEA intelligence analyst, wearing the wire that would capture every word of what came next, the wire that was supposed to bring down the cartels. The wire that instead became the instrument of her sister Maria's death. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of Libros Antiguos, her antiquarian bookstore tucked away on a quiet cobblestone street in Cartagena's old city. For 15 years this had been her sanctuary. Leather-bound volumes, the smell of aged paper, tourists looking for Gabriel Garcia Marquez first editions. A life scrubbed clean of blood and betrayal, someone new. Elena's fingers found the scar along her collarbone, hidden beneath her linen blouse, a souvenir from that night when everything went wrong. She'd thought she was so clever, feeding Escobar's organization false intelligence about Rodriguez's weapon shipments. The DEA had promised her that the misinformation would force a confrontation that would expose both cartels' operations. They'd never mentioned the village of San Rafael. They'd never mentioned that Escobar would redirect his rage toward the innocent. 237 people died in San Rafael that night, including Maria, her husband, their 3 children. Elena's entire reason for joining the DEA in the first place, to protect her family, had become the very mechanism of their destruction. She flipped the photograph over. Written in careful block letters, La Noche de los Testigos. You remember. The bell above her shop door chimed, and Elena quickly slid the photograph into her apron pocket. A young man entered, maybe 30, with the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the room. Tourist, she told herself, but her instincts, dormant for 15 years, whispered otherwise. Señora Vasquez? His Spanish carried the lilting accent of the Caribbean coast, but underneath it, something else. Something familiar that made her stomach clench. Yes. How can I help you? I'm looking for a specific book about Colombian history, the cartel wars of the 80s. He moved closer to her counter, and she noticed he favored his left leg slightly, an old injury, something with first-hand accounts. Elena's mouth went dry. I have several volumes on that period, academic text mostly. Were you looking for anything in particular? Stories about the witnesses, the people who saw things they shouldn't have seen. His eyes locked onto hers, the ones who survived when they shouldn't have. The photograph in her pocket seemed to burn against her hip. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a casual customer browsing for local history. I'm afraid I don't have anything like that in stock, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The survivors of that period, most of them prefer not to tell their stories. But some do. He reached into his jacket, and Elena's hand instinctively moved toward the drawer where she kept the .38 revolver, another relic from her previous life. Some have been waiting a very long time to tell their stories. He pulled out a business card. Nothing more. But as he placed it on the counter, she saw the small scar on his wrist. shaped like a crescent moon. A scar she'd kissed goodnight 1,000 times when he was 5 years old and couldn't sleep without his tia Elena's bedtime stories. Miguel Maria's youngest son. The room tilted. Miguel had died with the rest of them in San Rafael. She'd seen the bodies. She'd identified what was left of her family in the morgue in Bogotá. The DEA had shown her the photographs, made her face what her intelligence had cost. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Tia." The word hit her like a physical blow. Tia, aunt, the name he'd called her when he was small and still believed the world was safe, still believed his aunt worked for the good guys. Miguel smiled, and for a terrifying moment, it was exactly like Escobar's smile in that ballroom 37 years ago. The smile of someone holding all the cards. "We have so much to talk about," he said, pocketing his hands casually. "About that night, about the recording, about what really happened to the witnesses." He paused at the door. "I'll be in touch soon. We're going to revisit some old memories together." The bell chimed again as he left, and Elena sank onto the stool behind her counter, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Miguel was alive. The nephew she'd mourned for 15 years was alive, and he knew exactly who she was. More terrifying still, he knew what she'd done. The past had finally come calling, and this time there was nowhere left to run. But what did he want? And after all these years of silence, why now? The answers would reshape everything she thought she knew about that night. Don't miss tomorrow's chapter. Hit that subscribe button and join us as Elena's carefully constructed world begins to crumble, one devastating revelation at a time. Elena sat frozen on her stool for what felt like hours, though the antique clock on her wall marked only 17 minutes since Miguel had walked out. The business card he'd left on the counter remained untouched, a white rectangle that might as well have been a loaded gun. She couldn't bring herself to read it, couldn't bear to see whatever identity he'd constructed from the ashes of the boy she'd failed to save. The smell of old leather and aged paper that usually comforted her now felt suffocating. Every familiar detail of her sanctuary seemed to mock her. The first edition Cien Años de Soledad in the window display, the hand-painted sign reading Libros Antiguos that she'd commissioned from a local artist, the worn Persian rug where children sat cross-legged while their parents browsed. This life she'd built book by book, day by careful day, was nothing more than an elaborate tomb. She'd believed she was Elena Vasquez, antiquarian book dealer, a woman who knew the provenance of every volume on her shelves, who could spot a valuable binding from across the room, who made decent coffee for her regular customers and always had a bowl of water outside for the neighborhood cats. A woman with no family left to lose, no past worth remembering. But Miguel's eyes had stripped all of that away. In them, she'd seen herself reflected as she truly was, Carmen Elena Rodriguez, former DEA intelligence analyst, architect of the San Rafael massacre, the woman who'd loved her nephew so fiercely she'd joined federal law enforcement to protect him, only to become the instrument of his supposed death. The morning heat was building outside, and through her window she watched Cartagena come alive. Street vendors setting up their fruit carts, early tourists already armed with cameras and guidebooks, children in school uniforms hurrying past on their way to classes, life continuing its ordinary rhythm while her world collapsed inward like a dying star. She thought of Isabella Martinez, who came in every Tuesday morning for her weekly dose of romance novels, always asking after Elena's health with genuine concern. Of Father Santos, who stopped by each Friday afternoon to browse the theology section and invariably ended up sharing stories about his parishioners over coffee. Of little Tomas, barely 6 years old, who begged his grandmother to bring him here every weekend so he could sit in the children's corner and lose himself in picture books about dragons and pirates. These people had become her family, not by blood but by choice, by the quiet accumulation of small kindnesses and shared moments that made up a life. They knew her as someone safe, dependable, someone who recommended books based on their interests and always remembered their names. They had no idea they'd been loving a ghost. What would happen to them when the truth came out? Because it would come out. She could see the inevitability in Miguel's smile, feel it in the careful precision of his timing. He hadn't approached her impulsively. This was orchestrated. planned with the same methodical patience she'd once applied to intelligence gathering. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years learning to read people, to spot deception, to uncover hidden connections. Now someone was using those same skills against her, and she was as helpless as any target she'd ever pursued. Elena's hand drifted to the photograph still tucked in her apron pocket. That ballroom scene held so many secrets, so many threads of connection that had taken 37 years to weave into whatever web now surrounded her. 200 witnesses to Escobar's humiliation, but who were they really? She remembered faces from that night. Cartel lieutenants, corrupt politicians, business leaders, even a few she'd suspected were foreign intelligence operatives. Some would be dead now, claimed by violence or time. Others would have risen to positions of power, carrying that night's secrets with them like buried shrapnel. Had Miguel been tracking all of them, building some kind of network from the survivors and their children? The boy she'd once known had been brilliant, reading at 10, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of adult hypocrisies. What kind of man had that brilliance become when forged in the fires of survivors' guilt and betrayal? The bell above her door chimed again, making her heart stutter. But this time it was only Mrs. Gutierrez, one of her regulars, looking for a cookbook to replace one damaged in her recent kitchen fire. Elena helped her with practiced ease, discussing the merits of various volumes, while part of her mind remained trapped in that moment when Miguel had smiled his Uncle Pablo's smile. When Mrs. Gutierrez left, Elena finally reached for the business card. Her fingers trembled as she turned it over. Miguel Santos, historical consultant, specializing in recovered narratives. Below that, a phone number and email address, nothing else. But the name stopped her cold. Santos. He'd taken Father Santos's surname, the priest who'd probably performed last rites over the bodies in San Rafael, the priest who now stopped by her shop every Friday, never knowing he was drinking coffee with the woman responsible for the massacre he'd helped clean up. Another thread in Miguel's web. Another connection she'd been blind to. How long had he been watching her? Elena's hands shook as she set down the business card, her mind reeling with the implications of Miguel's chosen surname. Father Santos had been coming to her shop for 3 years. 3 years of gentle conversations about theology and local history, of shared coffee and comfortable silences. Had every visit been orchestrated? Had the priest been reporting back to Miguel, feeding him details about Elena's quiet life, her routines, her vulnerabilities? The phone rang. The sharp trill cut through the morning silence like a blade. Elena stared at the ancient rotary phone on her counter, a relic she'd kept because it matched the shop's aesthetic, because tourists found it charming. It rarely rang. Her few suppliers had her mobile number, and most customers simply walked in. It rang again. A third time. Elena's throat constricted. She knew, with the cold certainty of prey sensing a predator, that Miguel was on the other end of that line, that he was calling now, minutes after leaving, because he wanted her off balance, reeling from one revelation before he delivered the next blow. On the 4th ring, she picked up. Libros antiguos. Hello, Tia Carmen. Her birth name on his lips was like ice water in her veins. Only family had called her Carmen. Maria, their parents, Miguel himself when he was small and couldn't quite pronounce Elena properly. Everyone else had known her as Elena Rodriguez, then Elena Vasquez after she'd constructed her new identity. But Carmen, that had been reserved for the people who loved her. You're probably wondering how I survived, Miguel continued, his voice carrying that same careful control she remembered from his childhood. Even at 5, he'd been deliberate with his words, thinking before he spoke. The official report said no survivors. Very thorough work, that report. The DEA made sure of it. Elena gripped the phone tighter. Miguel, Do you know what it's like to hide in a chicken coop while men with machetes search for you? I was 8, Tia Carmen, 8 years old, and I had to lie perfectly still while they killed everyone I'd ever loved. Do you know what that does to a child's mind? The words hit her like physical blows. She'd seen the aftermath, the bodies arranged in the village square like broken dolls. The DEA had assured her there were no survivors. They'd showed her the forensic reports, the photographs. They'd let her believe that at least Miguel's death had been quick. The chicken coop saved me, Miguel continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow made it more terrifying. Old wood rotted through in places. I could see everything through the gaps between the boards. I watched them line up the families. I watched them make the children watch their parents die first. Psychological warfare, they called it. Break the spirit before you break the body. Elena's legs gave out, and she sank onto her stool again. Miguel, please. I watched them burn the church with the wounded still inside. I listened to Padre Santos beg for mercy. The real Padre Santos, not the man you've been sharing coffee with every Friday. His laugh was sharp, bitter. Did you really think that was coincidence, Tia? Did you think it was chance that brought a priest with that particular name to your little sanctuary? The room spun around her. The Father Santos she knew, gentle, bookish, with kind eyes and stories about his parishioners, was part of Miguel's elaborate fiction. How deep did this deception go? How many of her relationships, her connections, her carefully constructed life, were actually Miguel's creation? The massacre lasted 6 hours, Miguel continued relentlessly. 6 hours while I lay in my own urine and terror, watching Escobar's men turn my world into hell. And do you know what I kept thinking about, Tia Carmen? I kept thinking about you. About how you'd promised to protect us. About how you'd joined the DEA to keep the bad men away from our family. Tears streamed down Elena's face, but she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe around the weight of his words. But here's the interesting part, Miguel said, and she could hear the smile in his voice again, that terrible echo of Pablo Escobar's predatory satisfaction. It wasn't until years later, when I started digging into what really happened that night, that I discovered the beautiful truth. The intelligence that led Escobar to San Rafael? It didn't come from a cartel informant. It didn't come from corrupt police or government officials. Elena's heart stopped. It came from you, Tia Carmen, my beloved aunt, the woman who raised me when Mama worked late, the woman who taught me to read, the woman who promised to keep the monsters away. His voice dropped to a whisper. You were the monster all along. The line went dead. Elena sat in the sudden silence, the phone still pressed to her ear, as the last 15 years of carefully constructed peace crumbled around her like ancient paper touched by flame. Elena's hand remained frozen around the phone receiver long after the dial tone began its monotonous drone. The sound stretched into eternity, a mechanical heartbeat marking the death of everything she'd believed about her hidden life. When she finally set the phone down, her fingers moved with the deliberate precision of someone defusing a bomb. Careful, controlled, fighting against the tremors that threatened to betray the chaos expanding inside her chest. She would not break. Not here, not in the shop that had been her sanctuary. If Miguel was watching, and she had to assume he was, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her shatter completely. But denial crept in like morphine, dulling the sharp edges of revelation. Perhaps she'd misunderstood. Perhaps trauma had twisted Miguel's memories, turned coincidence into conspiracy. Father Santos couldn't be part of this elaborate fiction. She'd watched him bless the children who came into her shop, had seen genuine tears in his eyes when he spoke of parishioners lost to illness or violence. No one was that skilled an actor. Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled to his number, thumb hovering over the call button. She could simply ask, casual inquiry, Father, I was wondering about your background. Have you always served here in Cartagena? Something innocent that would either confirm or shatter Miguel's claims. But even as she began to dial, doubt crept in. What if Miguel was right? What if the gentle priest who'd become one of her few real connections was nothing more than another thread in a web 30 years in the weaving? She canceled the call. Instead, Elena walked to her front window and studied the street outside with eyes that hadn't truly seen in 15 years. The fruit vendor on the corner. Had he been there when she'd first opened the shop? The woman who sold newspapers from a folding table. When had she first appeared? The barista at the cafe across the street who always waved when their eyes met through the glass. Was his friendliness genuine or choreographed? Paranoia, she told herself. Miguel's accusations were poisoning her perception, making her see manipulation where only ordinary life existed. This was what trauma did. It infected everything, turned even innocent moments into potential threats. But her DEA training whispered otherwise. Coincidences were rare in intelligence work. Patterns meant something, and the pattern emerging around her 15 years of carefully cultivated normalcy was too intricate, too perfectly designed to be accidental. The bell chimed again, and Elena spun toward the door with her heart hammering against her ribs. But it was only Tomas, the 6-year-old who came every weekend, tugging his grandmother's hand toward the children's corner, where picture books waited in colorful rows. "Señora Elena!" Tomas broke free and ran toward her with the uninhibited joy of childhood. "Abuela says I can pick 2 books today because I helped her at the market." Elena forced a smile, kneeling to his eye level. "2 books? What a lucky boy. Have you finished the dragon story from last week?" "Sí, and the dragon saved everyone in the end, just like you said he would." Tomas's eyes sparkled with the absolute faith children placed in adults who kept their promises. "Do you have more stories about heroes?" The innocent question hit Elena like a knife between the ribs. Heroes. She'd spent 15 years surrounded by stories of heroes, knights and dragons, brave explorers, characters who fought against darkness and emerged victorious. Children like Tomas looked at her as someone who understood the difference between good and evil, someone who could guide them toward stories that would teach them how to be good people. If only they knew what she really was. "Señora Elena?" Tomas tilted his head, studying her face with the uncanny perception children sometimes possessed. "Are you sad?" "Just tired, mijo," she managed, standing and taking his small hand. "Come, let's find you those hero stories." As she guided Tomas toward the children's section, Elena caught sight of his grandmother hovering near the poetry shelves. Carmen Morales, a retired teacher who'd been coming to the shop for 4 years. She always let Tomas browse while she selected volumes of Neruda or Garcia Lorca, usually ending up in conversation with Elena about literature, life, the beauty of raising children in a world that seemed increasingly dark. But now, Elena found herself studying Carmen's movements, searching for tells, for any sign that this too was performance rather than genuine connection. When Carmen glanced up and smiled, Elena felt sick with the realization that she was dissecting the facial expression of a grandmother watching her beloved grandson choose picture books. This was what Miguel had done to her with one phone call, turned every relationship into a question mark, every moment of connection into potential deception. He'd weaponized her own survival instincts against her, made her doubt the very foundations of the life she'd rebuilt. As Tomas settled into the reading corner with his chosen books, Elena retreated behind her counter and stared at Miguel's business card. The morning sun streaming through her windows suddenly felt too bright, too exposing, as if the entire world could see through the careful facade she'd maintained. Somewhere out there, her nephew, the boy she'd failed to save, the man she'd failed to recognize, was watching and waiting. The question that terrified her most wasn't what he wanted. It was how long he was willing to wait to get it. Elena stared at Miguel's business card until the letters blurred, Carmen's gentle conversation with Tomas fading into white noise. The morning that had begun with such ordinary promise, sunlight through windows, the familiar ritual of opening her shop, regular customers following their comfortable patterns, now felt like the final scene of a play she'd been unknowingly performing for 15 years. When the grandmother and grandson finally left, their cheerful goodbyes echoing hollowly in Elena's ears, she locked the front door and flipped the sign to Cerrado. It was barely noon, but she couldn't maintain the pretense any longer, not with Miguel's words still burning in her mind like acid. "You were the monster all along." Elena climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment above the shop, each step heavier than the last. The small space had always been her sanctuary, whitewashed walls lined with books, a tiny kitchen where she made coffee each morning, photographs of landscapes she'd visited during her years of hiding. Anonymous places where Elena Vasquez had existed peacefully, leaving Carmen Rodriguez buried in the past. But now the photographs looked different. Had Miguel been there too, watching from a distance as she'd stood on those beaches, walked through those markets? Had her moments of supposed freedom been just another kind of prison, with bars she'd been too naive to see? She pulled a wooden box from beneath her bed, hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside lay the artifacts of her real life, the life she'd tried so desperately to leave behind. Her DEA badge, tarnished now with age, photographs from before San Rafael, when she'd believed intelligence work was about protecting people like her sister's family. A letter from Miguel, written in a child's careful script for her 35th birthday, thanking her for teaching him to read and promising to make her proud someday. Elena lifted the letter with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. Miguel's 8-year-old handwriting was cramped but determined. Each letter formed with the concentration of a boy who wanted desperately to get it right. At the bottom, he'd drawn a picture of the two of them holding hands outside his house in San Rafael. Stick figures with enormous smiles, surrounded by flowers and a blazing yellow sun. "I love you, Tia Carmen. You are my hero." The paper crumpled in her grip as Elena's composure finally shattered. 30 years of suppressed grief came pouring out in jagged sobs that seemed to tear something vital inside her chest. She'd mourned Miguel's death, had carried that guilt like a stone in her heart, but she'd never allowed herself to fully grieve what her choices had cost. The children who'd looked up to her, the sister who'd trusted her, the boy who'd called her his hero right up until the night she became his destroyer. Miguel had survived that massacre, but the innocent child who'd drawn stick figures and written love letters had died just as surely as the rest of his family. What had emerged from that chicken coop wasn't her nephew. It was something forged by trauma and betrayal, shaped by 30 years of planning revenge against the aunt who'd failed him when he needed her most. Elena forced herself to unfold the letter, smoothing out the wrinkles her grip had left. The paper was yellowed now, the crayon drawing faded, but Miguel's words remained clear: "You are my hero." The irony was devastating. She'd joined the DEA because of him, because of her desperate need to protect her family from the violence consuming Colombia. But intelligence work had compromised her in ways she'd never anticipated. The information networks, the careful cultivation of sources, the moral gray areas that seemed reasonable when lives hung in the balance. It had all led to that terrible night when competing loyalties finally collapsed into betrayal. She'd been feeding information to the Americans while maintaining her cover within Colombian intelligence circles, playing all sides, believing she was smart enough to protect everyone who mattered. When Escobar's people had demanded intelligence about rival operations, she'd given them what seemed like harmless details about a small village where nothing important ever happened. San Rafael had been her sacrifice to maintain her position, to keep gathering intelligence that would eventually bring down the cartels. She'd convinced herself that a few rural families were acceptable losses if their deaths helped her protect thousands of others. It was utilitarian calculus, cold, logical, necessary. Except one of those acceptable losses had been her own nephew. Elena's phone buzzed against the wooden floor where she'd dropped it. A text message from an unknown number. "The children's corner in your shop is lovely. Tomas seems very attached to you, just like I was once." Her blood turned to ice. Miguel had been watching even as she'd helped the little boy choose his books, had seen her kneeling beside another child who trusted her completely. The implicit threat was clear. Her past hadn't just caught up with her. It was reaching toward the innocent people she'd grown to love. Outside her window, Cartagena continued its afternoon rhythm, but Elena could no longer hear it. All she heard was the echo of Miguel's voice, promising revelations that would destroy everything she'd built from the ashes of her crimes. The reckoning she'd avoided for 30 years was finally beginning. Elena clutched the phone, staring at Miguel's threat about Tomas until the screen went dark. Her reflection stared back from the black glass. A 58-year-old woman who'd spent half her life hiding from the truth. But hiding was no longer possible. She needed answers, real ones. Elena descended to her shop and pulled out the yellowed phone directory she kept beneath the register. Her finger traced down the listings until she found what she was looking for. Iglesia San Pedro, Reverend Santos Eduardo. The address listed was in the old quarter, 15 minutes away. If Miguel was lying about Father Santos, she'd find the real man at his real parish. If he was telling the truth. The walk through Cartagena's cobblestone streets felt like moving through a dream where every familiar detail had shifted slightly out of focus. The same vendors, the same tourists, the same afternoon rhythms, but all of it potentially choreographed by her nephew's 30-year plan for revenge. Iglesia San Pedro sat on a quiet corner, its colonial facade weathered but well-maintained. Elena pushed through the heavy wooden doors into cool shadows that smelled of incense and old prayers. A few elderly parishioners knelt in the front pews, their whispered devotions echoing in the vaulted space. "Puedo ayudarla?" Elena turned toward the voice and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The man approaching was indeed Father Santos, but not the Father Santos she knew. This priest was younger, with a fuller face and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The same gentle demeanor, the same soft-spoken manner, but unmistakably a different person. I'm looking for Father Santos, Elena managed. You found him. The priest smiled warmly. Eduardo Santos, how may I help you? Do you have any other priests here? Perhaps someone who visits other parishes? Father Santos shook his head. I'm the only priest assigned to San Pedro, have been for 8 years now. He studied her face with growing concern. Are you feeling well, Senora? You look quite pale. Elena's knees nearly buckled. 8 years. The man she'd been sharing coffee with every Friday, the gentle soul who'd become one of her closest friends, had claimed 20 years of service at various parishes across Colombia. He'd told her stories about his seminary training, his early assignments in rural villages, his calling to serve the poor. All lies, all of it carefully crafted fiction. The priest who says he serves here on Fridays, Elena whispered. Tall man, perhaps 60, gray hair, very soft-spoken, claims to have known parishes in rural areas. I'm sorry, but there's no one here matching that description. Father Santos's concern deepened. Perhaps you're thinking of a different church? There are several parishes in the old quarter. But Elena was already backing toward the door, mumbling apologies, her mind reeling with the implications. If Miguel had been masquerading as Father Santos for years, how long? How many Friday morning conversations had been interrogations disguised as fellowship? How many times had she confessed her loneliness, her small fears, her growing attachment to regular customers like Tomas and his grandmother? She'd given him everything, every detail of her carefully constructed life, handed over like gifts to someone she'd trusted completely. Elena stumbled back onto the street, the afternoon sun feeling harsh after the church's cool shadows. Her phone rang and Miguel's number appeared on the screen. Feeling enlightened, Tia Carmen? You bastard. The words came out strangled, barely human. Now, is that any way to speak to a priest? His laugh was soft, almost fond. Though I suppose our theological discussions are concluded. You seemed so comforted by our talks about forgiveness, about carrying guilt. I found them quite therapeutic myself. Elena pressed her back against the church wall, needing something solid to anchor her as the full scope of his deception crashed over her. How long? Since you opened the shop. 15 years of Friday mornings, listening to you slowly reveal yourself. Do you know how long it takes to become convincing as a priest? The seminary training, the false credentials, the careful construction of a believable history? Years, Carmen. But I had nothing but time. You're insane. Am I? Miguel's voice sharpened. Or am I simply thorough? You taught me to read, remember? I became very, very good at it. Intelligence files, DEA records, cartel archives that survived Escobar's fall. I read everything about the night you murdered my family. I never meant... Of course you didn't mean to. That's what makes it so perfect. His tone turned almost conversational again. Pablo Escobar meant to kill people. The cartel soldiers meant to terrorize villages. But you just made a small calculation, traded a few insignificant lives for the greater good. That's so much worse than honest evil, don't you think? Elena closed her eyes, but she could still see Miguel's childish drawing, those stick figures holding hands beneath a smiling sun. The meeting, she whispered. You want me to remember the meeting. Oh, Tia Carmen, you still think this is about what you remember. His voice carried that terrible echo of childhood affection corrupted by adult rage. This is about what you've forgotten, what you've convinced yourself never happened, what the DEA helped you bury so deep you actually believe your own lies. The line went dead, leaving Elena alone on the street with the devastating realization that 30 years of carefully constructed truth was about to crumble completely. Elena stood frozen outside Iglesia San Pedro, the phone dead in her trembling hands. Passers-by flowed around her like water around a stone, their conversations and laughter feeling impossibly distant. The afternoon heat pressed down on her, but she couldn't stop shivering. What you've forgotten, what you've convinced yourself never happened. Miguel's words echoed in her skull. each repetition chipping away at the carefully constructed narrative she'd lived with for 3 decades. The DEA had debriefed her extensively after San Rafael, had helped her process the trauma, had given her the psychological tools to understand that intelligence work sometimes demanded terrible choices. They'd assured her that the village massacre was an unforeseeable consequence of necessary operations. But now those assurances felt hollow, like scripts she'd memorized to avoid confronting something too painful to acknowledge. Elena forced herself to walk, her legs unsteady beneath her. She needed somewhere safe to think, somewhere Miguel couldn't watch or follow. The old fortress Castillo San Felipe. Tourists crowded there during the day, but she knew hidden corners where she could disappear into stone and shadow. The climb up the fortress's ancient pathways left her breathless, but the physical exertion helped clear the panic from her mind. She found a secluded alcove overlooking the harbor and sank onto the weathered stones, finally allowing herself to think. 15 years. Miguel had spent 15 years sitting across from her every Friday morning, playing the role of Father Santos with such perfect conviction that she'd never questioned it, not once. The gentle priest who'd listened to her fears about growing old alone, who'd offered comfort when nightmares occasionally shattered her sleep, who'd celebrated her small victories and mourned her quiet losses, all of it performance, all of it designed to extract information while slowly, methodically, rebuilding trust between them. The cruelest part was how well he'd understood her. Every conversation had been perfectly calibrated to her emotional needs. When she'd struggled with loneliness, Father Santos had reminded her of the community she'd built around her bookshop. When she'd wrestled with unnamed guilt, he'd offered theological frameworks for understanding forgiveness. When she'd worried about children like Tomas, he'd praised her nurturing instincts. He'd become exactly the confessor she needed, someone who could absolve her without requiring full confession. Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found James Morrison's number. Her former DEA handler had helped facilitate her disappearance, had checked on her periodically during the early years. If anyone could tell her what she'd forgotten, what had been buried so deep even she couldn't access it anymore, it would be James. The call connected after 3 rings. Carmen Rodriguez. James's voice carried the flat professionalism of someone who'd been expecting this contact for years. I wondered when you'd surface. You know. It wasn't a question. You know he found me. Miguel Santos. Yes, we've been aware of his activities for some time. A pause. The sound of James settling into what would clearly be a difficult conversation. How much has he told you? That I murdered his family. That there's something about the cartel meeting I don't remember. That the DEA helped me bury the truth. Elena's voice cracked. James, what happened that night? What aren't you telling me? Silence stretched across the connection. So long Elena thought the call had dropped. When James spoke again, his voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. The intelligence you provided about San Rafael wasn't randomly selected, Carmen. It was specifically requested. Elena's blood turned to ice. Requested by whom? By us. The agency needed to feed Escobar's people something that would maintain your cover while advancing our operations. San Rafael was chosen because it was isolated, because the casualties would be limited, because it was expendable. The words came out hollow, mechanical, because it was necessary. You knew this, Carmen. You argued against it initially, but you understood the strategic value. Your sister's family living there was an unfortunate complication. The fortress walls seemed to be closing in around her. Elena could barely breathe. I knew? You volunteered the village yourself eventually. Said it was the only way to maintain your position, that the intelligence you could gather would save thousands of lives in the long run. You were right. The information you provided afterward helped us dismantle 3 major trafficking networks. Elena bent forward, pressing her forehead against her knees as the terrible truth finally surfaced. Fragments of buried memories began bleeding through the psychological walls she'd constructed, arguing with James in a safe house, studying maps of rural villages, circling San Rafael with her own hand while explaining why it was the perfect sacrifice. She hadn't just failed to protect her family. She had actively chosen to destroy them. The trauma protocols we used afterward, James continued, his voice gentle but implacable, they were designed to help you compartmentalize the operational necessities. To let you remember yourself as someone who'd made a mistake, rather than someone who'd made a choice. Elena's phone slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering against the ancient stones. 30 years of carefully maintained innocence crumbled away, leaving only the devastating truth: she hadn't been Miguel's protector who'd failed him. She had been his executioner all along. The phone lay silent against the stone, but James's voice echoed in the fortress walls around her. Elena remained bent forward, her body folded in on itself as if she could physically contain the horror spreading through her chest. The memories were surfacing now, no longer fragments but complete scenes playing out with devastating clarity. The safe house in Bogotá, the wall covered in maps and photographs, James pacing as she traced her finger along rural roads, her voice clinical as she explained why San Rafael would work perfectly. Isolated enough that casualties could be contained, poor enough that media attention would be minimal, small enough that Escobar's people would accept it as legitimate intelligence without questioning the source. "My sister lives there," she'd said, and James had stopped pacing. "That makes it more convincing," she'd continued before he could object. "Personal knowledge. They'll trust the intel completely if they think I'm betraying family." She remembered now, all of it. The careful calculation, the strategic thinking, the moment she'd drawn that final circle around San Rafael and sealed her nephew's fate with her own hand. Footsteps echoed in the fortress corridors, slow and deliberate. Elena didn't need to look up to know who was approaching. She'd heard those same steps for 15 years, every Friday morning as Father Santos entered her bookshop with coffee and gentle smiles. "Hello, Tia Carmen." Miguel's voice held no warmth now, stripped of the priestly cadence she'd grown to love. She forced herself to look up, to see him as he truly was for the first time in 3 decades. He was still the boy from San Rafael, but transformed by years of purpose. The same dark eyes, but colder. The same careful movements, but predatory now. He wore simple civilian clothes, jeans, a white shirt, as if shedding the priest's cassock had revealed his true self underneath. "You remember now," he said, settling onto the stone across from her. "I can see it in your face." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. The distance between them felt both infinite and impossibly small. This was still the child who'd drawn stick figures holding hands, but she was no longer the aunt who deserved that love. "I've been waiting for this moment for 30 years, Miguel continued, his voice steady and calm. "Waiting for you to stop hiding behind your convenient amnesia and face what you did." "I know what you want," Elena whispered. "My confession, my acknowledgement, my—" "No." Miguel's interruption was sharp. "That's what you still don't understand. I don't want your guilt, Carmen. I don't want your apologies, or your tears, or your belated remorse." Elena stared at him, confusion cutting through her despair. "Then what?" "I want you to choose again." Miguel leaned forward, his eyes burning with decades of controlled fury. "Right now, today, the same choice you made 30 years ago." From his pocket, he withdrew a manila envelope, thick with photographs and documents. He spread them on the stone between them with careful precision. Surveillance photos of Tomas walking to school, his grandmother shopping in the market, the other children who visited Elena's bookshop, maps of their neighborhood, floor plans of their homes. "Tomas trusts you completely," Miguel said conversationally, "just like I did. His grandmother thinks you're a gift from God, a lonely woman who's found purpose in caring for local children." Elena's hands flew to cover her mouth, but Miguel continued with relentless calm. "There's a drug operation moving through the neighborhood next week. Large shipment, heavily guarded, very dangerous. The authorities need intelligence about the exact timing, the routes they'll use." He smiled, and it was terrible. Someone who knows the local children's schedules could provide that intelligence. Someone who's cultivated trust and access. "You're insane." "I'm offering you the same choice you made before." Miguel's voice never changed tone, never lost its deadly reasonableness. "Help gather intelligence that will save hundreds of lives when this shipment is intercepted. The only risk is to a few local families who might get caught in the crossfire. Acceptable casualties for the greater good." Elena understood now. This wasn't about revenge, it was about revelation. Miguel wanted to prove that she was still the same person who'd sacrificed family for strategic advantage. That 30 years of peaceful bookshop life hadn't changed her fundamental nature. "I won't," she whispered. "Won't you?" Miguel gathered the photographs slowly, deliberately, even knowing that your refusal means the shipment continues south, where it will fuel violence across 3 countries, even knowing that hundreds will die from the drugs and weapons this operation provides. "I won't use those children. You used me." The simple statement hung between them like a blade. Elena met her nephew's eyes and saw not hatred but something worse, a terrible, patient understanding. He knew exactly who she was, what she was capable of, what she would choose when forced into the same impossible corner. And as Elena stared at the photographs of Tomas's trusting smile, she realized with growing horror that Miguel might be right. Elena stared at the photographs scattered between them, Tomas's innocent face smiling up from the ancient stones. The harbor wind carried the scent of salt and diesel, the same wind that had blown across these ramparts for centuries, indifferent to the human dramas played out in their shadow. "No," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the city below. Miguel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "No? I won't do it." Elena began gathering the photographs with steady hands, her movements deliberate despite the tremor in her voice. "I won't use those children. I won't sacrifice more innocence for the greater good. I won't be that person again." For the first time in their conversation, Miguel looked genuinely surprised. Even knowing the consequences? Especially knowing them. Elena met his gaze directly, seeing her nephew's face superimposed over the cold stranger he'd become. "You want to prove I'm still the same woman who circled San Rafael on that map. But you're wrong, Miguel. That woman died in this fortress 30 years ago, the night I finally remembered what I'd done." Miguel studied her with the intensity of a predator evaluating wounded prey. "Pretty words, Tia, but words are just—" "Then watch." Elena pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized years ago but never used. The call connected after 2 rings. "Policía Nacional, Captain Herrera. This is Elena Vasquez. I have information about a drug shipment moving through Getsemani next week." She kept her eyes locked on Miguel's face as she spoke. "I'm calling to report it directly to you, not to request operational involvement. The children in that neighborhood need protection, not exploitation." She ended the call and set the phone on the stone between them. Miguel's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something raw and furious underneath. "You think that absolves you? One phone call erases 30 years of cowardice?" "Nothing erases what I did." Elena's voice carried a weight that seemed to settle into the ancient stones around them. "Nothing brings back your parents, or your sister, or the life you should have had. I know that, Miguel. I've known it every day for 3 decades, even when I convinced myself I'd forgotten." The wind picked up, scattering the photographs. Miguel made no move to collect them. "But I won't compound that evil by creating more orphans," Elena continued. "I won't let my guilt become an excuse to hurt more children, and I won't let your pain become a reason to perpetuate the cycle that destroyed our family." Miguel stood abruptly, his careful composure finally shattering. "Our family? You murdered our family." "Yes." The simple acknowledgement hung between them like a prayer. "I did, and I'll carry that truth for whatever time I have left, but I won't carry it forward into new tragedies." For a long moment they stared at each other across the space where the photographs had been. Miguel's face cycled through emotions, rage, disappointment, something that might have been grief. Finally his shoulders sagged slightly. "I spent 30 years planning this moment," he said quietly. 30 years preparing to prove that you were still the same monster who could sacrifice family for ideology. I needed you to be irredeemable. Because redemption is harder to live with than revenge?" Miguel's laugh was bitter, empty. "Because forgiveness is impossible if people can change." Elena reached into her bag and withdrew a weathered photograph, Miguel's childhood drawing, the one she'd kept hidden in her shop all these years. The stick figures still held hands beneath their crayon sun, faded now but still radiating the innocent love of a child who'd believed his aunt would protect him. "I kept this," she said, offering it to him. "Not because I deserved to, but because I needed to remember what I'd lost, what we'd both lost." Miguel stared at the drawing but didn't take it. That child is dead, I know. Elena's voice broke slightly. I killed him too. The admission seemed to drain the last of Miguel's fury. He sank back onto the stone, suddenly looking older than his years. They sat in silence as the afternoon light shifted across the fortress walls, casting long shadows between them. What happens now? Miguel asked eventually. Elena folded the drawing carefully, returning it to her bag. Now you decide who you want to be. The man who spent 30 years pursuing justice, or the boy who believed people could love each other despite their flaws. And you? Elena stood slowly, her joints protesting after the long conversation on cold stone. I go home. I close my shop. I leave Cartagena. She paused, looking out over the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like toys. And I try to figure out how to live with the truth. Miguel remained sitting as she walked away, a solitary figure against the ancient walls. Elena didn't look back, but she carried the image with her. Her nephew, alone with his ghosts and his choices, just as she'd been alone with hers for 30 years. The fortress had witnessed centuries of human drama, had sheltered both victims and perpetrators within its stone embrace. Today, it had witnessed something rarer, the moment when the cycle of retribution ends not in victory or defeat, but in the quiet recognition that some wounds are too deep for revenge to heal. Elena descended toward the city below, her footsteps echoing in corridors that had absorbed the weight of countless confessions, carrying her toward whatever peace might be possible for those who've learned to live with unforgivable truths.